Where did we all come from? Did God just speak and everything appeared? Or was it a slow process that occurred over many, many years? And what about evolution? Does it contradict the Bible? And is it okay for us as Christians to believe this stuff? We'll talk about all of this and more. So get ready to dive in. For literally thousands of years, people from all nations and tribes and cultures believed that the origins of life came from divine intervention. But that all changed in the 19th century with a guy that many of you have probably heard of. His name was Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. So before we get into the Bible, we have to talk about what evolutionary theory actually says. Evolutionary theory says that biological variations can lead to significant biological changes due to genetic drift and natural selection. Basically, if you're not a scientist, this means that small changes can lead to large changes. Now, most people agree with this. But there are a few things that we have to talk about, a few key differences. See, microevolution, micro just means on a small scale. That means that there are adaptations within species. Kind of like the beak of a bird can change over time. However, according to many evolutionary theorists, there is even evidence to suggest that these changes can happen between species, that one species can evolve into another. Like, we can go from something that's not human to humans. This we call macroevolution, evolution on a large scale. That perhaps everything in existence did not just appear one day, but started at a microscopic level and slowly evolved over millions and billions of years. But this seems to go directly against what the Bible teaches us in Genesis 1 about how the world and everything in it was made by God. So as Christians, how should we think about this conundrum? Is evolution true and the Bible false? Or is the Bible true and evolution false? Or is there a way that we can reconcile the two? Now, I want to make this really clear. In either an evolutionary perspective or a literal creation perspective, you are putting faith in something that you cannot prove. You have to weigh both science and theology. I'm going to give you two serious things to consider when answering this question. One of those is scientific, and one of those is theological. Now, the first one is that there are legitimate scientific critiques for macroevolution, evolution on a large scale. The first critique is that macroevolution may explain the origin of species, but it does not explain the origin of life. How do you get life from nothing? There has to still be a creation. And so either way, you're still stuck with reconciling creation, a creator. The second thing is that there is a lack of what we call transitional fossils between species. Now, if macroevolution were true beyond a reasonable doubt, you would assume that we would see a lot of transitional creatures. However, the fossil record doesn't really show that. And another thing to consider is that genetic mutations form too slowly to give any real advantage. So think about this. Why did birds develop wings? Would the nubs of wings, what started as wings, really give an advantage to a certain species or to certain creatures that would allow those to continually develop into wings? These are some of the things that are difficult for scientists to answer, even though they do have some answers out there. For some, the evidence of evolution is just too overwhelming to ignore. So, is there a way to reconcile evolution with faith? Those who claim to believe in the Bible and evolution are what we call theistic evolutionists. And that brings us to our 30-second theology.
Hello, class. Welcome to 30-second theology with Nerd Russ. Today we are talking about theistic evolution. Intern, start the clock. So, theistic evolution comes from the root word theos, which means God. It's a Greek word. Therefore, theism means belief in God, and theology means the study of God. So, if naturalistic evolution means evolution caused by natural sources, theistic evolution means evolution caused by God. Stop the clock.
So although theistic evolution may seem like a solution to this conundrum, before we affirm this, take a minute to consider one major theological implication. See, with theistic evolution, the interpretation of death drastically changes in the Bible. Romans 5:12 says that death spread to all men because all men sinned. Although spiritual death is certainly affirmed throughout Scripture, passages like these in Romans have historically been interpreted as literal, physical death. Adam sinned, an actual person. And now there is physical death in the world. And this is why Christ's physical resurrection is such good news, as Romans 6, right after this, makes clear. See, Christ's death, who was also an actual man, in order for that to make sense, Adam also has to be an actual man. His death was physical, and his resurrection was also physical. He suffered the consequences of sin, both spiritually and physically, to give us the consequences of righteousness, both spiritually and physically. However, if macroevolution were true, death would have existed long before men and women could have sinned. See, the concept of natural selection is death. You don't have evolution without death. And therefore, we would have to change the historical interpretation of physical death as a natural consequence of sin. Now, perhaps that's okay with you. But for me, the theology makes too much sense the way it has always historically been interpreted. And the science behind macroevolution just a little bit too shaky. So, what do you think? What are some of the things that we haven't mentioned that are important to consider here? What questions do you have? Feel free, if you do have questions, you can text them to this number, and we will be happy to get back to you. But I hope that we can all agree on one thing, at least, that the explanation of the origin of life given in the Bible is the best way for us to understand our world and ourselves. See, there's a reason that God told us about creation like he did. He didn't give us a scientific explanation necessarily. The Bible tells us about ourselves and our world. It gives us purpose and meaning. And I pray that even as you wrestle with understanding it, that you will find great hope in it as well. So we will see you next week. God bless.